Hello and welcome. I'm Arun Naidu, filling in for Riz Khan. Today, the Iraq crisis and the White House. President Bush is coming under even more pressure. Members of his own Republican Party say they want to see progress in Iraq or they will withdraw their support for the war. The development comes amid a flurry of diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict. Vice President Dick Cheney is in Baghdad at the start of a visit to several regional allies. And Iraq's top security official, Muwafaq al-Rubai, is here in Washington asking Congress not to abandon the Iraqi people. So, how deep is the Iraq quagmire? On today's show, we'll get the real story of what's going wrong in Iraq from a top insider. Dr. Ali Allawi is a former Iraqi Minister of Finance and Defense. His new book, The Occupation of Iraq, Winning the War, Losing the Peace, is not only a detailed review of the last 4 years, it's also a blueprint for the way forward. Allawi argues if the crisis is not resolved, it may set the stage for a wider regional conflict that could last up to 100 years. Don't forget, we take your calls on the show. The numbers are there at the bottom of your screen. Joining me now from London is Dr. Ali Allawi. He served in Iraq's Transitional National Assembly and held the top posts in the Trade, Defense and Finance Ministries following the US invasion. Dr. Allawi, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Well, let me start with current developments. As I mentioned, Vice President Dick Cheney is currently in Iraq. Word is that he will pressure the Iraq government to fulfill certain conditions, benchmarks as they have been called. What needs to change now for this to happen? The situation has been, the situation hasn't changed in the last few years, the last few months. What do you think will happen now?
Well, the situation really has changed, but it's changed perhaps too much in too many different directions. What happens now, I think, is that the way that the government is in some ways trapped to a set of milestones that are quite difficult to implement given the political realities inside Iraq. And we're talking about basically an attempt to include into the structures of government groups that had been hostile to it and groups that are not totally committed to the political process. To do that, obviously, you have to cede power. And this is not something that can be done lightly without taking into account the effects on it, on those groups that are going to be gainers or losers. So it is not something that you can just sort of wave a magic wand and expect results. These milestones have very serious domestic implications in terms of distribution of power.
Well, from what you're saying, there appear to be goals here which appear to oppose each other. On the one hand, the United States Congress, the American public to a large extent, is saying we want the troops out, we want those goals to be met. On the other hand, what you're telling me is that these are very difficult goals to meet. So what's the way forward?
Well, I mean, this is really a conundrum, is that the democratic process in Iraq, or the political process, has led to the establishment in Baghdad of the majority Shiite Islamist parties. And these people have an agenda. They have a certain program of government that is not necessarily the same as you would want to have if you're looking for national unity and reconciliation between all groups inside the country. So there is a built-in contradiction, as it were, between the results of the political process, the empowerment of hitherto disempowered groups and communities, and the attempt to assume that these are not going to have much effect on the political scene. It is a very, very difficult tightrope to walk. This government has been trying to walk it, so far not necessarily successfully, and piling on the pressure on this government is not likely to accelerate results. It may very well have the opposite effect.
You know, you have advocated a federal system, a devolution of power. Is there any danger that that kind of devolution could ultimately lead to Iraq being partitioned?
I mean, the partition of Iraq into separate states is not just an act on the part of those who want to do it, but also requires international recognition. I mean, the breakup of Yugoslavia could not have taken place if member countries of the European Union and then the UN were not prepared to recognize the resultant entities. In the Middle East right now, I don't think there's any single country that is prepared to recognize any of the constituent parts of a broken up Iraq as an independent state. So I don't think this is really on the card. When you talk about devolution, it doesn't necessarily lead to breakup. I think this kind of equation is too facile. Devolution of power, when you are unable to reach a common consensus as to the purposes of central government is a necessary outcome. And I think it's one that is indicated the more you end up with a kind of stalemate at the center, which is what we have right now. Devolution already has taken place as far as the Kurds are concerned. We're talking about 20 to 25% of the country is outside of the control of the central government. It is in some form of confederal arrangement with it. So when we talk about the breaking up of the country, already significant parts of the country are outside of the framework of a central united government. So the pointers to a federal Iraq are already there, and I don't think that they are necessarily a poor choice for this country if we're not able to find a solution that's going to satisfy all the competing groups for central power.
Mm-hmm. When you look at the way forward and you look at the neighborhood in which you exist, isn't that also a problem? Because you may have reconciliation in Iraq, but if you look at some of the neighboring countries like Jordan, countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, they have interests which are interests of their own. They may, as some people say, are narrow interests. They're not looking at the interest of Iraq.
No, it's true. I mean, Iraq is one of those few countries whose unfortunate geographic position basically obliges it to take into account the consideration of other countries as to what its own internal political arrangements should be. Because changes inside Iraq have been so dramatic in the last 4 years that they've had, I think, a profound influence on each of the neighboring countries. In some cases, strategic influence to the point where it may jeopardize or threaten their own national security. For example, you cannot really exclude the effects of a greater Kurdish autonomy inside Iraq on the Kurds inside Turkey. So to the Turks, this is a matter of national security. It's even an existential matter. Similarly, for other countries in the area, like Saudi Arabia, for example, if you have a determined Shia majority central government, it's going to affect their relationship with their own Shia minorities and so on down the line. The changes in Iraq basically profoundly imbalanced the distribution of power in the Middle East. Whether for good or bad is not a matter, but this imbalance of power, where you had a state that was at least a known quantity in terms of its structure, in terms of its relationship with other countries, is now up in the air. And nature abhors a vacuum. And what we have here is the potential for nearby countries to feel threatened by changes inside Iraq that they are not necessarily to their liking. And this holds true for nearly every state in the area, with the possible exception of Kuwait, whose interests in Iraq are quite limited. But if you look at Iran, if you look at Syria, if you look at Jordan, if you look at Turkey, if you look at Saudi Arabia, each one of these countries has been profoundly affected by the events and changes inside Iraq.
Okay, Dr. Allawi, let's take a call now from one of our viewers. This is Mohammed in Austria. Mohammed, go ahead with your call.
Yeah, my question is that since there's been so much killing and mayhem in Iraq due to this illegal occupation, the situation is so convoluted. I mean, is there going to be any solution that anybody can come up with to make Iraq more stable in the foreseeable future? Thanks.
All right, thanks, Mohammed. Dr. Allawi, I presume you heard that question.
Yes, I have. I mean, this obviously goes to the heart of the issue. The situation has become immensely more complicated as a result of the failure of the initial assumptions, as it were, as to what kind of country Iraq is going to be following the overthrow of the regime. The overthrow of the regime was supposed to lead to some kind of democratic, liberal, secular, non-sectarian order that will be based on the joy felt by a substantial majority of the Iraqi population to having this dictatorship overthrown. The reality turned out to be entirely different. And as we have progressed and have been unable to change the initial assumptions, we're now faced with a far more complex set of issues. But I don't think they're necessarily not resolvable. They are resolvable, but they require, in fact, an increased commitment on the part of the United States to a political and diplomatic resolution to the crisis, and a ratcheting down of the military, the unidimensional military approach. What we have to do is to recognize that the consequences of the war in Iraq, the invasion and occupation of Iraq, have unleashed forces that were in no way taken into account when the war was launched. And we have to recognize that these forces, which include, for example, the empowerment of the Shia, the fact that the democratic process in Iraq has led to the empowerment of Islamist parties, the empowerment of the Kurds, the relative disempowerment of the Sunni Arab community. These are profoundly significant events and were not calibrated into the equation when the invasion and occupation took place. We now have to deal with these issues and deal with them in an open and in a pragmatic way, and ways that takes into account also the consideration and effects of these changes on regional powers. This will take a far greater commitment politically and diplomatically than we have right now. It may require even a 180-degree turn on the part of the US administration as to how to tackle the unfolding crisis in Iraq. Otherwise, we'll be just going up the creek, basically, paddling up the creek in a way that will not necessarily lead to increased stability.
And do you believe that this administration, the current administration in Washington, is capable of turning around 180 degrees?
Well, the signals are no. That the signals appear to be that the United States is continuing to pursue a unidimensional military approach. But in parenthesis, there seems to be some signals that they have recognized that they have to take into account the consequences of this war, both internally and in the area. One of these signs, obviously, is the recent conference in Sharm el-Sheikh, but it doesn't go far enough, I think, in trying to engage the regional powers in ways that goes to the heart of the problem. If you ask me, will this administration do a U-turn? I think the odds are against it. They will still try to resolve the problem in a military way and hope that one way or another they can cobble together a form of unity government that can at least withstand the medium term and be able then to manage the country while they then pull out. But this in my mind is not necessarily a recipe for success. It's going to lead to greater sectarianization inside Iraq, which will make it very difficult for Iraq to come to terms with its neighbors as well as internally.
Okay, we have another caller on the line. This is Sakar from Chad. Sakar, go ahead with your call.
Hello, my name is Samhar. I'm calling from Chad, but I'm an Eritrean national. I'm calling you now to ask precisely what the West's reaction would be towards other dictators, because yes, we have removed Saddam Hussein, but well, what we are left with is just an absolute catastrophic, disastrous mess, and a disaster to humanity. Whereas now, I would, for example, be very happy to see the regime in Eritrea leave, but then again, if that's going to be at a price of peace, bloodshed, and having women and children massacred, that is a very, very disastrous issue. Now, what do you think Western leaders and other leaders around the region are thinking at this point in time? Whereas, do we actually prioritize peace before blaming and sending in tanks, or do we just go ahead and the end justifies the means? I think that's what they call it. That we remove a dictator, and then we're left with a disastrous outcome, which is really sad, and we don't have an answer how to solve it, really.
Let me get this right. Are you talking specifically about Eritrea here?
No, about any other country that is under any, say, dictatorship where there is maybe lack of freedom of speech or anything like that. But what I'm trying to say is basically.
All right, thank you. Let me put that question to Dr. Allawi. Dr. Allawi, I think this is more of a philosophical question between, do you send the tanks in first, or do you try to find some other kind of solution first, which was what our caller was asking there from Chad?
I think, it's a very good question, and it's one that I have been wrestling with for some time. The question is that when is a war or an invasion, when does the trampling over the sovereignty of a country be justified under international law? And there is something called the rules of a just war, and I think it did apply to Iraq in the case of the former regime. It involves, the former regime was implicated in massive crimes against humanity, both against the Kurds and against the Shia and against the entire Iraqi population. And it launched a number of wars in the area and was a cause of great deal of instability and misery. So if you want to use the rules of a just war, I think you can apply it to Iraq, and you should apply it to certain tyrannies around the world that exhibit the same characteristics in terms of their complete disregard for their own population, the megalomaniacal way in which they manage the country. These rules, I think, should not be discarded simply because the Iraq experiment, as it were, went haywire. It went haywire not because overturning tyrannies necessarily leads to chaos in the country. It doesn't. Overturning tyrannies without managing those countries in an appropriate way and following coherent policies, yes, it does lead to chaos. So if what has happened as a result of the chaotic circumstances in Iraq is that the international community generally now shies away from tackling dictatorships and tackling tyrannies, then obviously that's a bad outcome.
Dr. Allawi, I want
be
to
very careful.
I'm sorry, I just want to disturb you there. I want to get in a very quick email question. We don't have too much time.
Yes.
And this question is, does Dr. Allawi think that one day in Iraq we will have a situation like what happened in Northern Ireland yesterday, where Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness, once staunch enemies, agreed to share power and so put an end to decades of terrorism and conflict?
I hope so. I mean, I'm cautiously optimistic about the medium-term future for Iraq, assuming we take remedial action, assuming we recognize that the policies that have been pursued in the past, even though they were done through a democratic and constitutional framework, have led to an impasse. Remedial action, if it's taken now, I think will perhaps cure the patient and will allow both Sunnis and Shias to sit together and find far more commonalities in their position than differences that have driven them into this suicidal killings that we have on both parts, on both sides of the fence. So to me it is in fact salutary to see enemies such as Martin McGuinness and
Ian Paisley,
Reverend Paisley get together, and I don't see why we can't do it. Iraqis, especially the Arab population in Iraq, has been living together at peace for centuries. Of course they have differences, but these differences were reconciled.
Dr. Allawi, I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop there. We've run out of time. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And we move on now to tomorrow's show. We're joined by the singer and activist Michael Franti, who took it upon himself to go to Iraq, the Palestinian territories and Israel to get a first-hand account of the human cost of war. Don't forget, if you have any thoughts about pressing issues around the world, send us your emails to riz@aljazeera.net. See you next time. Street Talk is next.